The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Russell Banks, author of Rule of the Bone. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office. Russell, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Eileen.
The book Rule of the Bone is a coming-of-age story, I would guess. A story about a 14-year-old boy named Chappie who enters a life of minor crime and tries to find family and community and finally does come to find himself, at least. I have to tell you that I burned my whole dinner one night becoming so absorbed in Rule of the Bone.
Well, that's nice. Thank you. I'm sorry for your dinner, but that's very nice.
And what I found, what for me made it a stunning novel was the fact that it evoked such strong feelings in the reader. When I read the first chapter, as I often, have the first chapter of 25 books going, to see if I really feel like reading any further. When I read the first chapter, I thought I could wring that kid's neck.
Right.
And I knew that I had to read on further and see why I felt so strongly about this kid. And maybe it's because I'm a parent myself. But
Well, also he's testing the reader, I suppose, in the same way that a kid tests any adult first encountered. There's a certain kind of sullenness and apparent callowness in his presentation in the opening chapters, and as he gradually obtains the reader's or listener's trust. I mean, it's a told story, not a written story quite. Then I think he starts to become more self-revealing and more reflective and more self-questioning, and most people have said that to me, that the first couple of chapters he is one of those kids that you see in the malls, you see on the streets, with the mohawk and the nose rings, and he's kind of in the baggy pants and the big sneakers, and he's the kind of kid who looks at you in a kind of suspicious and sullen way, and most adults kind of avert their gaze and in a way make him invisible. And he is one of those kids, and so it takes a while for him to get us over our prejudices and biases in a way. I mean, he knows they're there, so he's trying to test us the first opening pages, I think, in a way.
well, and in a way, in chapter 1, we don't know about his parents.
Right.
We think they might be perfectly ordinary for all we know.
And he reveals a little bit at a time as he goes along, yeah. And I didn't want to put it right up front, in the fact that he's been abused by his father and his stepfather. I didn't want to put that right up front either, because it would have flipped the weight of the story entirely. Then it would have become a kind of domestic drama about sexual abuse, and I was after something else, really, more of a social satire and a tall tale, and a picaresque kind of novel that I was interested in writing. And so I had to withhold, or he had to withhold that information till fairly far down, because it wasn't the central fact in his life, really. I mean, it was certainly a significant fact, and it had a great deal to do with his deep mistrust of adults, and in particular his stepfather. But it wasn't the central fact in his life, as I think for a number of
And it was part of the layering kind of his character, that it's almost as if we see a peeling away of the onion.
And he's in the process of self-discovery too. I mean, he doesn't, when he begins talking, know everything about himself. I mean, he keeps on saying, maybe I think this, maybe I think that, maybe this is right, maybe I made a mistake years ago. He's not clear and who is, really, but as he goes along, he gradually comes to greater and greater degree of self-understanding.
And part of his guide to self-understanding is the Rastafarian who enters his life a little later on in the book in the school bus. And I'm wondering if he's drawn to the Rastafarian's philosophy because it's foreign and exciting and new to him, or whether it offers him something that he's never had before. The Rastafarian uses terms like praise and joy a lot, which must have been a whole new world to poor Chappie.
Give praise and thanks, he says. Give praise and thanks. And the idea of giving praise and thanks is a bit of a foreign one to this lower middle class white boy from upstate New York who feels cast out. Praise and thanks for what, you know? And yeah, he has to learn that. I think one of the things that attract him to, I mean, he's like all kids, really. I mean, he's looking for, there's a kind of a universal need in children and adolescents, which is very basic, and it doesn't change whether, you know, the nuclear family explodes or not. I mean, you still, those needs are 50,000 years old, I mean, to be, for a child, it's biological almost. I mean, you need to be protected, and because you're weak and vulnerable. You need to be instructed because you're ignorant of the ways of the world and you have no power in it. And you need to be respected for yourself, and because you're a human being and an individual, and you have consciousness. And families, you know, conventionally and traditionally have been the means to meet those needs, have had the means and ways to meet those needs. But in the, you know, in the breakup of the nuclear family, which is now the rule and not the exception in our culture, kids have to start, or are increasingly looking elsewhere to meet those needs.
Well, there's this whole question of from my generation, we said children learn their values from not only parents but good adult role models in their life. And in Chappie's life, who we should say later becomes Bone, there are no really good adult role models. Even the Rastafarian is not.
Well, he's a mixed character, like every. I'm sure even the good adult role models are mixed as well at best. I mean, that's part of the process of growing up, is learning to love somebody who has weaknesses, and who is a role model as well. But yeah, he has to learn to. He has to find protection and instruction and love, really, outside the conventional sources, outside the world that has been given him. And he tries, you know, as most kids do, I mean, who are hit the streets or for one reason or other fall through the cracks. They build a family. They find a family elsewhere. They go elsewhere for that. I mean, he falls in with a motorcycle gang, and then he ends up with the Bong brothers at this abandoned school bus, and then he hooks up with this escaped migrant apple picker from Jamaica, who is also a kind of shaman figure and a bit of a rascal and kind of a shady figure in his own right too.
And all of these are in some way unsatisfactory for him, so he keeps moving on.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I guess says something universal too about our search, all of our search for family and our community.
Well, we have to move on.
We have
really,
to
it's
find
change
it.
or die, and he can't go backwards. He can't become a child again. He has to go forward, and you know, he compresses into 1 year. The book covers the story is basically about 1 year of his life, and he compresses into that 1 year. Through the magical means of fiction, what most of us probably go through, if we're lucky, in 20 or 25 years, the movement from child to adulthood. And he has to use, in order to achieve that fast, some fairly extreme means.
There's an interesting little side bit that I think says something about Chappie's character and the little girl that joins them in the bus, and he makes every effort to see that she's returned eventually to her mother, but that's a very ambiguous, given his own background with his mother.
Well, at that point, yeah, he believes, well,
ambiguous.
any mother is better than no mother at all, he says, and he wants very much to believe in the myth of family. I think that the deep insight he has early on is that there's a very wide gap between the myth of family on the one hand and the reality on the other. And one of the almost skitsy way we talk about family values and family life today is a way of denying that gap in that reality. He intuits that reality is there, but he's not happy with that, and he makes these kind of desperate, lurching moves toward claiming the myth every now and then. And he's implicated every time he does it. It ends up finally disillusioning him. I mean, he's implicated in what happens to Rose. He can't fully protect her because he goes ahead and believes in that myth that you know, any mother is better than no mother at all. Or when he himself tries to go back home again, back to his stepfather and his mother, or when he searches on and finds and tries to take up with his real father, his genetic father, and he's still groping after that myth. That's a powerful myth, you know. It's ancient, and it exerts a tremendous amount of power over our imaginations.
Do you think that some homeless kids are better off on the streets than they are with neglectful parents?
Well, I don't think, you know, I can't think about it in an either-or kind of situation. I mean, it's so hypothetical. And, there probably are cases, and I'm sure there are cases, where they're better off on the streets than they are with their parents. I mean, I don't agree with Chappie that any mother is better than no mother at all, or any father is better than no father at all. I really don't. I think some are positively malignant, and that kids can, in many ways, help themselves. The real problem is that is economic in a way. For kids, I mean, the most immediate and pressing problem for them, and the greatest danger to them, I think, on the streets is that when you are either rejected by or abandoned or otherwise have unavailable to you your parents' economy, then you've only got the economy of the streets. And in late 20th century America, the economy of the streets is sex and drugs, and there isn't any other way for a kid to keep from ending up, you know, starving under a culvert somewhere. And so that's where they're going to go, and that's dangerous. That kills people. Literally. You know.
It also sort of speaks about that's the education of the streets, and compared with formal education that's going on in our schools, it's interesting to me that Chappie is sort of part of this whole group of kids that reject formal education, at least as it's offered in their terms. And yet there are a lot of kids today that come from, quote, good families who are also rejecting formal education and moving onto the streets too, even though they have no economic need to do so.
Yeah, it's hard to know who's rejecting whom there, though. Sometimes I wonder if the kids are rejecting the school system, or is the school rejecting them, and basically regarding them as disposable. And I think an awful lot of kids, I mean, we treat them as if they're making these big existential decisions about their futures, and in fact, maybe we're just as a society or as a culture, we're making the decisions unconsciously and casting them out because we're unable and unwilling to take the responsibility for their care and their protection.
And we don't
society.
know what works. And as Chappie says, adults don't know how kids think.
They don't know how kids think, right?
Which is interesting. I wondered about your thoughts about that. Since we all were kids, how come we lose our ability to know how kids think? Is it a generational
Maybe too painful
thing?
to remember. I don't know. I'm one of those people who thinks kids have a really steady and clear, magnetically polarized moral compass. That it's pretty steady, and that it slowly, as you become an adult, gets wobbled off true north and to a degree, and that really it's the people at the top of the pecking order who tend to not know right from wrong. You know, it's all those white-collar criminals who don't believe they were doing anything wrong, and can't believe it, can't understand it. They're the ones that don't know right from wrong. Kids tend to know right from wrong very clearly, I think. So I'm not so sure that our failure. I think our failure to remember clearly what it was like to be 12, 13, 14 years old has a lot to do with a certain amount of shame that we knew then what was right and wrong, and we've lost that in many ways. And I don't think it's just a failure of memory. On the other hand, novelists tend to have a kind of I think arrested development in some ways. It's not that difficult. Most of the novelists I know, and I include myself, I guess, can click rather quickly back to the emotional state of adolescence and can remember quite vividly and tend to act out the rest of their life most of the dramas that they first experienced and imagined as adolescents. So it wasn't all that hard for me to get into Chappie's head once I determined that I wanted to look at the world for a year and a half or so of my life from the point of view of a turbulent, troubled, angry 14-year-old boy. And once I got there, I found it, you know, a very revealing and challenging and instructive experience.
Well, you've said elsewhere that your novels are, the themes of your novels are Russell Banks searching for his father.
Yeah, I think I may have been a little bit ironic and self-mocking there, because it does sometimes seem that. I look at it, I say, my God, haven't I got anything else to write about?
Yet it
Yeah.
makes a compelling story,
Yeah.
even though you've used it in
Yeah.
more than one book.
Well, it's a Homeric story. It's one of the oldest stories in the West, I think, as well. I mean, it's an old story. It's probably in the DNA or something, and it's so basic. And I do end up, I guess, retelling it. There are certain obsessive themes that you keep going. One writer always goes back to. Anyhow, I think was it Flannery O'Connor said that by the age of 14, you've experienced already everything you need to know to spend the rest of your life writing.
And like the author who says that everything I knew I learned in kindergarten,
In kindergarten,
even
right,
at a younger age.
Right. No, everything I learned, everything I needed to know, I think I learned by the time I was in high school, but I don't know if I'd say kindergarten.
Well, this is a book about the loss of innocence too, and Chappie has many losses along those lines. I'm wondering what the connection is maybe between adolescence and maturity. Is maturity just a matter of lots more losses of innocence?
Well, he goes through a series of, I guess I think of them as crossings, or rites of passage maybe. Some of them are more dramatic and have larger implications than others. Some are small and easily processed and so forth. And I think each of these passages lead him to a greater understanding and a clearer understanding of his relation to the larger world around him. He manages to acquire, and through that understanding, acquire a greater amount of power in that relationship too. He's able to.
And in reality, his world does enlarge.
Yeah,
page
it
by
does
page,
literally. Yeah,
almost.
quite literally. It starts to expand out from this small town in upstate New York into the malls of Plattsburgh, and then from there out into the big world in Jamaica and so forth. And by the end, he's lighting out for the territory on a boat. And he does gain at each of these crossings, I think, what we need as adults. So I guess by that, yes, maturity is probably a good term. By the end, I feel he has acquired I have 4 children, what I would love my 4 children to have acquired and think they have now that they're in their 20s. He has an ability to love other people, and he loves the truth. He's managed to sustain that into adult, or into his own near adult life, and use them, his ability to love other people and to love the truth, to control his own destiny to a considerable degree. He has a skill in he's a cook. He can control his own economy now. He's not dependent on either the economy of the parents or the economy of the streets.
He can grow ganja plants in
He's a
Jamaica.
good
And the
gardener.
ultimate
He's a very
irony is that doesn't he use Ronald Reagan's camouflage
Right.
from Grenada to shade the
Right. Yes, you remember that.
ganja
Yeah.
plants.
Yeah. Yes, he can put almost anything to good use. But he's a smart kid now, and he's in charge of his own destiny to a considerable degree. And that's really all you want from a mature person, that they have those capacities and basic skills.
Are you saying that we almost need a certain amount of difficulty in our life to come to that kind of maturity?
Well, no, I wouldn't say we need it. It's probably not available without going through a lot of difficulty. I can't imagine obtaining that, especially as rejecting a society as we have regarding children. Irresponsible, I should say, a society as we have regarding children. I think that in order to obtain those capacities, you have to go through an awful lot of turmoil and difficulty. It's not easily got in this world. It's not easily got in the schools. It's not easily got at home. It's not easily got in the streets. We scratch our heads and wonder why these kids don't have these, or they don't seem to have these capacities, why they seem so alienated and angry and self-destructive. What the hell? We've been using television to babysit them for the last 25 years. And, I mean,
And
they're-
not very quality television at that.
well, we've turned them into a consumer group. Instead of protecting them from an amoral, consumer-driven economy, we've colonized them with it, and you know, we've completely objectified them as consumers. You know, it's not be like Dad; it's be like Mike, and instead.
And this is kind of shown in the mall mentality.
Yeah,
and
yes, the franchising of the American family in a way. Yeah, no, it's something dark happened, I think, in the last 40 years in small increments, so that we're barely aware that it was happening, and it's happened over maybe 40 years, really since the 1950s, and we're now, you know, about the third generation into it, where in some awful way we abdicated basic responsibilities toward our children, and you know, I have my own theory about this, and I think it's very related to our having in the 1950s welcomed into the American home the most powerful selling tool known to man. We brought that blue eye, that magical blue eye, in and sat it down in the middle of the living room. And, you
the
know,
altar of the gods.
the altar of the gods. You know, I mean, historically, we've always been able to slam the door in a salesman's foot, you know, and the home had a kind of sanctity to it with regard to the so-called free economy, the consumer-driven hucksterism of our economy, which is amoral and turns everybody into customers and doesn't deal with them as human beings. And so we've always had the home to kind of exclude that, and to use the home to protect the weakest members of our society, who are least able to resist the blandishments of the huckster, until we invited the television in. And bit by bit, we've allowed the television, which exists solely for the purpose, except, of course, in circumstances like this, but really, I mean, commercial television exists for the sole purpose of selling consumer goods. It doesn't exist for any other reason. I mean, television doesn't exist to show sports events. Sports events exist in order to sell beer. And almost all the programming on commercial
And to
TV
evade
exists.
the advertising of cigarettes.
Exactly, exactly. And so now we have children watching television on average 7 hours a day. A third of the kids in America have their own TV set in their bedroom. The average kid at 5 years old, I read the other day, has watched 2,000 hours of television. I mean, I don't want to just beat on this one stick, but on this one horse, but it's a significant fact, and it's got an awful lot to do with the kind of social psychosis that we're talking about here.
And we're getting bigger and better sets, and they're
Yeah.
taking up more room in our homes.
Oh, yeah.
And
And they're putting them into the schools. I mean, they want to beam TVs into TV programming into the school, and they'll provide all kinds of television equipment and video equipment to the schools if the schools will only accept a few ads, right? And
Or
there you
beamed
go.
right toward
Yeah, I mean,
adolescents.
it's like a junkie standing at a schoolyard gate offering a little free, you know, a free taste, and if you'll just let me, you know, come inside the schoolyard.
well, going back to Chappie,
I didn't mean to get off on that.
I want to stay with this wonderful
Sure.
story. He goes to Jamaica, and he says an interesting thing, or at least I found this interesting. He said, if you change the way you look on the outside, this is after he took off his nose ring and,
Yeah.
and let his mohawk grow.
Right.
If you change the way you look on the outside, you feel different on the inside. I thought that was an interesting comment from Chappie and maybe from adolescents in general, in that I thought that adolescents were perturbed by adults who didn't look at the real
Well, I
person.
think that's,
And that they
yeah.
consider these things sort of external, and why are you bothered by the way I dress or look, because it's the real me that
Right.
Chappie seems to say something different.
Yeah, I think he's having some insight there into the feeling that, maybe the fact that the only thing he and kids like him have any power over or any control over is their body. And I think he might be talking about, you know, tattooing and body mutilation and extreme kind of hair and
the motorcycle gang.
In tattoo, yeah, I mean, actually, I think he makes that statement where he's just gotten the Crossbones tattoo, and it makes him feel different, and there's some kind of sense that, gee, it makes you feel like I have a little power here. I remember reading about and reflecting on eating disorders in kids, bulimia and anorexia, and one of the theories regarding it is that it's an exercise of power over the only thing the person feels she has any power over. It's usually female, is her body. If she can make it get smaller and smaller and smaller and bigger and bigger and bigger, it's like it's something you can control. And it's really an expression in some ways of your lack of control over anything else in your life. That's controlled by other people, other forces. You're just in some ways powerless. So I think that's what he's referring to there in some ways. An insight is, gee, if I change how I look on the outside, it changes how I feel on the inside.
Well, in the 2 minutes we have left, I want to save a little bit of time to ask you what you're working on next.
Well, it's also what I was working on before. What I'm working on next is trying to finish a book that I abandoned to write this book. About 5 years ago, I started writing a historical novel based on the life of the abolitionist John Brown and of Harper's Ferry, who's actually buried just down the road from my house in upstate New York, where he had a farm, and he and 11 others from the Harper's Ferry raid who were either killed in the raid or executed afterwards. Their bodies were brought back up and buried there. So it's a very ghostly presence down the road. And he's kind of haunted me anyhow since my college days. And so I worked on this novel, as I say, for about 5 years, since 1990 really. I started when I finished The Sweet Hereafter. And it became a kind of 900-page monster of a book, and I felt stymied by it, and I parked it for a year and a half to write this, and now I'm eager to get back to it.
So how does a novelist make those decisions to set something aside?
In desperation, I think. Not a rational decision. It's just, my God, I can't think of what to do with this thing today. I think I'll do something else, is what you do. Also, the world of Chappie and homeless kids and kids generally had been kind of creeping into my consciousness more and more. I've been teaching a workshop at a prison in upstate New York, and mostly dealing with drug dealers, 18 to 22-year-old kids who were drug dealers for the most part, and they were nonviolent felons. And I've been getting into their lives and their stories and hearing their stories, and they had become increasingly significant to me and with large implications. And so I was starting to look at the world through that angle for a while, and I wanted to follow that out.
Well, Russell, thank you for your timely story. I'm so glad you interrupted John Brown's Ferry to write this.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.